Welcome, everybody. Who's excited to learn about co-ops today? Should be good. Thanks to everyone for being here bright and early. My name is Brian Hill. I'm Business Development Director at Momentum. I also have a side hustle selling e-bikes. So I have another hat as a Be Local member and small business owner, like many of you here today. And I'm super interested in this topic and to hear your journey. Jared, this is going to be great. So get ready, buckle your seatbelts. I want to start with a land acknowledgement. So just take a minute here. Look out the window. Feel your feet on the floor. Maybe take a deep breath in and out. And I want to just acknowledge that we're gathering here today on the traditional territory of the Blackfoot Confederacy. So that's Siksika, Kainai, and Piikani nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina and Stoney Nakoda Nation and Métis Nation Region 3. And quick anecdote, this weekend, some of you maybe were out of the city, driving around a bit. It's that long weekend kind of goodness. Check out the mountains. I was driving by some horses, cows out there, and I was remembering Roy Bearchief, who's an elder that we've worked with a whole lot here at Momentum. He's Blackfoot. He was saying that the Blackfoot word for horse, so when horses came and began to be a part of the Blackfoot way of life, there wasn't a word yet for horse. And so they used the word elk and dog. And so the word in Blackfoot for horse is elk dog, which kind of makes sense, right? Like their dogs are what they use to kind of haul things from one place to another. And elk, yeah, there was lots of elk around. So next time you're driving outside the city and you see a horse, you can be like, hey, look at that elk dog over there. That's a great looking elk dog. People be like, what? What's that mean? The other thing I wanted to do is just make a quick connection to Momentum. So for whom of you is it your first time in this space? A few people, okay. Welcome here. We're so glad that you could make it. Just so that you're aware, Momentum is a nonprofit. We've been around for about 30 years, in this space for about 3. And so we work with folks to connect people who are living on lower incomes in Calgary to economic opportunity. So the vision for Momentum is that everyone in Calgary can access economic opportunity. And that's the connection with Be Local. Imagine the power of 200, 300, 400 Be Local member businesses that are interested in impact in our city and what that can look like. So in 2019, when that opportunity came about for Momentum to host the Be Local network, we're like, yeah, because moving ahead economically in our city is going to involve more than just a few nonprofits banding together. It's going to take the business community as well and everyone working together. So that's all I have to say. Without further ado, I'll hand it over to Phil and Jared. And thanks so much for being here.
Welcome, everyone. I've been getting some feedback. Why the heck is this happening on a Tuesday after a long weekend, so early in the morning? I hear you. I feel you as well. Part of the urgency and timeliness of this is that Jared is taking a much deserved break, and he was going to be gone for a couple of months. And I'm like, do we do this in the fall or we do this now when it's hyper relevant and timely? And I decided, forget everyone's long weekend. We're gonna have some coffee and we're gonna have an amazing conversation. So the timeliness of this I thought was unparalleled. So a couple of things before we kick out the conversation. You'll notice a phone number up there. This is to Jenna. Jenna's gonna be fielding questions for today. We're gonna try to have a nice organic flowy conversation where it's not interrupted a ton. And so if you ever have a question, send the text to Jenna, and then Jenna's going to look for themes with those questions and then send them to me. So I'm not on Facebook while I'm talking with Jared. I'll be monitoring questions and making sure that the most urgent questions come to the surface. And for those of you who haven't met me yet, my name is Philip, and I am with the Be Local network. As Brian had mentioned, it's stewarded by Momentum, but Be Local is a network of local businesses that are focused on community impact. And we have this belief that doing good is actually good for business. So what we're trying to do is highlight and showcase amazing different conversations that a lot of you are interested in. So our first Impact Learning series that took place in May, we did a conversation around a living wage and the complexities around paying a living wage versus a minimum wage. Today we're learning about co-ops. And so every other month or so, we'll be putting out different topics, all relevant to what matters to you as business owners and what's really important and urgent in the ecosystem today. So really thrilled and happy to see this is like a lot of your first time. Out of curiosity, how many people are not members of Be Local? If you just want to like raise your hand and then I can publicly shame you. Perfect. just a couple of you. Amazing. So it's great to see a lot of Be Local members in attendance. And so a couple things that I'll also put on your radar. We're shaking things up a lot this summer. We're going to be putting up some more events. I'll be speaking on those later on, but today is a good example of how we're trying to convene community in ways that are different than any other business network out there. Co-ops are such a foundational piece of community building and also like a foundational element of a business structure that really embodies community and relationship. And so when we heard the news about the Allium, we thought this would be an amazing opportunity to kind of like showcase what co-ops are to the city. So on that note, let's give a massive round of applause to Jared.
Thanks.
How are you doing, Jared?
Good. I'm doing well. Sort of finding some balance after a very tough 5 years or so, but also a lot of rewarding moments throughout that time. So yeah, just sort of soaking it all in, which is kind of nice.
Okay.
Yeah.
And Jared, I know like Jared is incredibly well read. He's incredibly intelligent and can take this conversation in a million different directions. So I'm going to try to like rein you in a bit because I know that you could just talk for hours on end on your own.
Thank you.
Let's just kick things off with, I think the big question that even some people like when they came into the room, this was the first question that they were like, what drew them to coming to this? What happened?
Yeah. Oof, that's not an easy one, maybe.
Oh, and actually, let me before you jump into that juicy question.
Yeah.
I just also want to stress that there was a massive team behind Jared that made this happen, but obviously Jared, just one person, one perspective that he's representing today, and so the rest of the team, there were other individuals involved, but today Jared will just be presenting his views and his thoughts and his opinions on what went down.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that. I don't know if I represent everyone's viewpoint. Probably close though. But maybe to get to what happened, it might be good to back up to the start, if that's okay. Because I think that really informs where we got to. So maybe I'll just quickly talk about the foundation of the Allium, and then we can get into some of how we decided to wrap up. But the Allium grew out of a graduate degree I did a number of years ago, investigating contemporary issues with our economy. Specifically, I was studying resistances to capitalism. I'm very much a structuralist. I do believe that a lot of our inequities intersect. I know that's an overused term, but the idea of intersectionality, a lot of our structures of oppression, quote unquote, intersect in our economy. And I am a firm believer in that. A lot of what I studied looked at that. I like to talk a lot, maybe this is an analogy less appropriate for right now, but I always like to think about really the root causes of why our society is the way it is. And when you look at sort of a history of pattern, you start to recognize, that there is something beyond, people not saving enough or whatever, that we are in the situation we are today, right? And so that sort of history is, people becoming obviously more stressed. We're all sort of double debt dependent household income. We're, all these things that we know. I mean, poverty, we have, I think, a child poverty rate in Canada that's close to 1/10. Was that what I read? Sorry, I want to make sure I'm not quoting made up stats to you all. It's easy to do. It's the poverty rate, rather. I think the child poverty rate's a little lower, but it's around 10%, which is wild when you think about a country like Canada. We're, 30, 40 odd million people. I mean, we have a lot of material wealth here. There's no reason that we should have close to 1/10 of our population living in a state of poverty. And I don't think that's like an accident. I do believe that this is in part by design for our economy. And so what I like to think about is maybe how do we start to address those root causes, those structural issues? And a really useful analogy I like to point to when thinking about this is it's sort of that old Desmond, I can't remember. Sorry, anyways, it's early, my brain's broken, but there's this idea of somebody comes to a doctor's office, right? And they're like, shit, doctor, I'm bleeding. And the doctor's like, oh God, what did you do? And, we sew you up, obviously, and send you back out into the world. And that person leaves the doctor's office and they walk into something and cut themselves again and come back to the doctor's office. And they're like, doctor, I'm bleeding. And she's like, oh God, what did you do? You cut yourself again. And she sews them up and sends them back out. And I think there's two ways of us addressing inequity in the world, and this analogy kind of relates to it. And one is through social care, which is super important. If someone is bleeding, if someone's cut, and they have an injury, we need to address that right now, without doubt. But at some point, we need to start looking at what those obstacles are, the table that the person's walking into. And so for me, like nonprofits or a lot of even social enterprises are kind of social care. It's putting the Band-Aids on the wounds. But we do all, I believe, need to start really thinking about the source of injury, the obstacle of injury. And until we start doing that, I don't think we'll actually create a meaningful change for equity in our society. I think we can, smooth out the rough edges and start to make things a little nicer for people, but I don't think we're actually going to start creating meaningful unity, meaningful equity for working class people in our society. And so a lot of what I studied looked at this, structural issues of inequity. And I believe, through my studies, what I realized is empowering workers in every way starts to create some change in that structure, however small. Obviously, if you are the one controlling the profit that you produce, you're probably going to make choices that are going to be better for your community. You're probably not going to, first of all, outsource all of your business. Hopefully, if you care about your society, you're not going to be dumping waste in your backyard. You're not, yada, yada. I mean, we can all understand that. You're probably going to make better choices for yourself. And also, you're not going to feel exploited. You're going to come together with your society. You're going to be making more money. You're going to feel more empowered. You're going to feel more connected. These things have dynamic and powerful ripple effects, when we start to empower workers. So all of this to say that I did this graduate degree for a number of years. Phil, you're not doing a good job. You just let me ramble for.
I'm seeing where you're going with this.
I'm getting there. It's a journey. Come with me. I mean, all of that. After I studied, for a number of years about sort of contemporary issues of our economy and empowering workers, and I finished this graduate degree, and I sort of moved back to Calgary. I was like, shit, what am I going to do now? What am I going to do with this thing? And I had this beautiful document that I wrote, and it sat on my shelf every day, and it was like, you're just an academic, do something with this, what are you doing? And eventually, sort of fell on the idea of creating a worker co-op, and talk a little more about co-ops and the various forms of them maybe in a bit, but worker co-ops are one form of organization in which all workers are owners of the space and they share profit proportion. There's lots of ways to structure it, but generally they share profit proportionate to hours worked in a fiscal year, and they use non-hierarchical governance models, and they just have all these pieces that I think really worked well with what I studied and what I looked at, and it made sense to me to make a worker-owned business. I thought this is the way of making a practical application of what I studied. And I was trying to think, what is it I'm going to make, and to maybe out myself here. Marx writes a lot in Capital about widgets, and I'm like, what the fuck is a widget? Like, I should make a widget factory. That would be great if I just knew what that was. And I never figured it out, but I do know restaurants. I've worked in restaurants a very long time, and I hate them, to be perfectly honest. I hate them very deeply. I love going to restaurants, and I love eating at restaurants. But just the way restaurants are structured are in my mind hyper capitalist. They are, you're outsourcing quote unquote. You're ordering everything from GFS or Cisco, which uses this economy of scale tactic, right? So they import tons of shit from overseas as cheaply as they can, using hyper exploitative labor practices and really poor ecological, care practices. They're super hierarchical. They're like very dehumanizing. They're really like on this like live fast, burn hard, burn out quick kind of model. A lot of really poor practices. And it was not something I wanted to be involved in anymore. I helped my sister run a pretty great restaurant in Vancouver for a number of years, and I've worked in the restaurant industry for a long time. I knew what it was about, and I was like, I'm done. And
quick side note on that, actually, Jared, because for those of you who were at our last Impact Learning series, we had Kevin Kent from Knifeware, and he's a big champion of the living wage. And part of his rationale for that was he had also been in the industry for a long time and realized that it's just the people at the top who make all the money. And if you're frontline staff or even some of the chefs, you don't make anything at all. And so there's this massive disparity between how hard some people are working and how much money they're actually getting paid at the end of the day. And so Kevin was kind of speaking last time just about his passion for a more holistic approach to what it looks like to be a good employer. higher salary above a minimum wage is one. This foreign concept of having 2 days off back to back, knowing your schedule a couple of weeks in advance, like some of these things that the rest of us take for granted. In certain industries, that's not often the case. And so I remember one of our first discussions when you were talking about worker co-ops, like you had no interest in actually starting up a restaurant. Like you were just mentioning how you hated them.
Yes.
So it's kind of funny that you ended up starting one.
I mean, so the way I got there was I just kept, I was like, widget factory, that's not a real thing. It's just an abstract concept to talk about capital. And, I don't know, maybe I love building. It's something that I'm very passionate about. And I was like, maybe like some kind of like building contractor co-op, but it's like, I don't have enough equipment to start, Anyways, it all just made a lot of sense in the end. My partner was like, dude, like, you know restaurants, right? Like, that's the thing you got to do. And I was just like, fuck, you're right. I know. And like most of my social circle is in restaurant. A lot of my social circle is in restaurants. So it was a logical step to make a restaurant and, to make a worker-owned restaurant. So I was actually really lucky to get in here with Momentum. They had a social incubator course. It was a business course that I took here and really helped me to refine the idea. And then I started like trying to think about recruitment, and it was like my wife was the first person, which is probably a terrible idea. And one of my best friends who lived across the street from me, and then people are always like, "Don't go into business with your friends," and they're partly right, but also maybe not. And started to just do that recruitment piece, and it was awesome. It was really exciting. If I could share, like we had this moment early days where we were building the co-op, and we were like making, like in my mind, we were making a socialist vegetarian restaurant in the heart of Calgary. Like I used to go to bed and just laugh every night. Like, this is the best joke. If this never even goes anywhere, this is just the best joke we could play on Calgary. Yeah, as it grew, and maybe we get more into like the operational stuff in a bit, but like, it was doing quite well. For sure. Like this year was a profit year for us in every way. Like we're making money. And the restaurant side of things were functioning really well.
And Jared, like for those of us who aren't like familiar or intimate with that industry, like when is it typical for a restaurant to like break even or make a profit?
So like when I did the business plan here, industry standard was like anywhere from $40,000 to $60,000 in losses in your first year. And that was just like what everyone said, that's what you just expect to do. That's just part of owning a business. And herein, I think, begins to like lie kind of the major issue with a lot of our understanding of business. It's like you have to go into massive debt to begin to play the game. And who is that debt tied to often? I mean, a private banking system in every way, and our interest rates are not great. So it's like we just begin to, limit ourselves. And it's not by choice. It is, again, by design. We don't have this choice. If you want to get access to capital, I mean, hopefully there's some great, social venture investment or local invest YYC. Like there are obviously some places, but for many people, who don't have the knowledge or the network or even like the time, you feel so stressed. Like a lot often in business, I think the stress level is quite high, and it's another sort of structuring piece that you're just like, I need money, I need this, I'm just going to do it, like path of least resistance, right? And so, anyways, sorry, where was I going?
I was just going to comment on something you just said there, but it's also another example of some of the systemic barriers for people to kind of play, right? To get in the game. Definitely. Is you need a credit history in order to access capital, right? Totally, and so if you're new to the country, that puts you at a disadvantage. And so there's all these different barriers, and you're kind of highlighting all these like different levers, these systemic issues that kind of put an unfair advantage on others.
Yeah. So I mean, anyways, we were excited in many ways that we were making a profitable business, and it took a lot, for, as we were saying, industry standards, or you lose, 50,000 give or take in the first year. Like in our first year of operations, we made $200 or something. And we were like, we made $50,200, like, because we weren't in the red, So it was like, wow. And that was, again, like, just because we refused, like, we were like, no, we're not taking these loans. We're not just going to buy everything new. We're not, like, we've got refurbished material everywhere we could. Like, I built it, like, I was there working all day and then there all night, like, building the space with some other folks. Like, we just did it, because we were like, fuck it, we're not going into massive debt to do this thing. We do not. And that was almost one of the core tenets in a way. And it takes privilege to be like, I'm not going to go into bank debt. Like, how do you do that? I just work really smart. You work hard. But pooling community capital is one way of doing that, right? Like a worker co-op model is that you're not one person putting up $50,000 to start your business, but you are 10 people putting in $5,000 to start a business. And $5,000, like, don't get me wrong, it's a ton of money for most working class people. That's what I set the buy-in at Allium, was $5,000. And like, I must have met with 40 to 50 people in the early days to just be like, hey, like, this is this thing we're doing, and you know, people in the industry, and so many of them were like, you know, I'm like a single parent, or I'm taking care of my parents, or whatever it is. Everyone has something, you know, and it's important to recognize that. That's like what, again, structures us as humans. So, you know, it's for the 40 or 50 people I met with, in the end, it was like 8 people that were like, yeah, like $5,000 is something that I could, you know, come together with right now if I needed. Anyways, sorry, I'm really meandering. Thanks, Phil. But you know, this was a profit year in every way. Last year was a profit year. Like, we actually never went into massive debt, which was awesome. I mean, COVID obviously fucked us super hard, as it did many of us, right? But at the same time, too, having the government supports really like helped us keep out of it. But what it did do, and I can't blame it all on COVID in any way, because that's not fair at all, but it did frustrate the goal for meaningful worker ownership, because it was like this period where we were, you know, our first year we got like Avenue Best New Restaurant, and we were busy. It was wild. Yeah. We were like just, you know, feeling like we were on this rocket, and people were excited. Like, we had owners, and then we had probationary owners that had to pass a 6-month period, and then they could buy in, and they were really excited. They were like, this is a thing, like, we're making money, this is great. And then, you know, when the buy-in time came for many of these people was when the shutdown had happened, and they were like, well, what am I buying into? You know, like an uncertain future. You don't have a business. Like, what is that? You want me to give you $5,000 to get paid right now? Like, you know, so there's a lot of like, I think there's a lot of like social and cultural barriers, but then there's like this very clear, like, we didn't have a business. We were just like a non-operating takeout and self-delivery business for a while, right? We did like the cooking classes that we did through Momentum, which was awesome, and we did like a packaged food line through Blush Lane and a number of places, which is still running actually. But it's like, it just felt really hard for workers, especially working class people. You know, we don't have a ton of money, so it's like, now you're asking me to buy in to get a wage. So I think that was kind of the start of it. And this year, yes.
How long were you guys running before COVID?
Just about a year. Yeah. So this year it became painfully clear. Our ownership base was down to 5-6 people. Some people had left over the years, and no one had really bought in. There was a bunch of half buy-ins, so people were on their way, but a lot of people hadn't bought in. And it was like, I was running a restaurant, I guess, to be honest. Like, I was just running a restaurant by the end. The 5 or 6 owners were kind of divided into our own area. So one person was running the packaged food line. One person was doing like all the admin kind of paperwork stuff. One person was just doing prep, which essentially didn't make sense, because like, we should have just hired a prep cook, you know? Like, why would an owner just like, that's all he did was prep? And it was great. It was so key in a business like that to have someone to rely on that you knew was going to be there prepping every day, 5-6 days a week. But it's like, there's so much more to running a business than doing your shift, obviously, right? And so, and then the other 2 was my partner and I. And my partner, like, we just had a baby not that long ago, so she was largely useless. She's not here, I can say that. No, I'm
Yowzers, this is being recorded.
I'm joking. Oh shit, it is. No, that's not fair. No, that's not fair at all. She is like obviously a rock, and like, you know,
she was on the floor serving.
Yeah, she is.
I'm going to vouch for
at like 9 months. Yeah. Yeah, but like, you know, it was like, it really did just come to this situation where we didn't have a worker co-op, I would say, in any meaningful way. We had a successful restaurant.
So what do you mean by that then, Jared?
Like, I think, so if we can get into maybe the nitty gritty of like what a worker co-op is, or maybe just co-ops in general. I mean, we must all be fairly familiar with co-ops. I figure, I mean, everyone knows the co-op.
Maybe just quickly, give a...
Sure, yeah. So I mean, I think we can understand co-ops in sort of 3 major forms. There's consumer co-ops, hybrid co-ops, and worker co-ops. And then there's more. There's multi-stakeholder co-ops and like tech co-ops. There's all kinds of co-op variations. But I think in a sort of a macro view, there's those 3 forms. So a consumer co-op is what we're all familiar with. The co-op grocery store or MEC or whatever, you buy a share into the space, and you get some like nominal, you know, kickback every year, and it's sort of, you can come to a shareholders meeting. they were powerful, I think, and they maybe still are to a degree, but not as much as I'd like to for pushing into the structures of society. But historically, consumer co-ops were super powerful because workers couldn't access affordable products, affordable goods without going through sort of centralized distribution centers. And so by pooling capital together to buy their own goods, they were then able to lower the cost and blah, blah, blah. They were also really huge in the prairies. Co-ops were huge here in Alberta, and I mean maybe a little less so now, but historically, like key, fundamental to settler foundation of this land, which for better or worse, was obviously why we are all here today. So I mean, we wouldn't be here probably without co-ops to some degree. So in Alberta, consumers through farmers or what have you would pool capital to access goods. The second form, worker co-ops, were also fundamental at the time. There was insurance-owned collectives, there were farm equipment-owned collectives. So worker co-ops are like a consumer co-op, but I think they become quite more radical because the people actually engaged in the enterprise are the owners, obviously. And it's that simple, right? Ideally, they can take, again, many different forms, but I think that the ideal worker co-op is non-hierarchical. It's about a rotation of roles, so trying to empower and teach people new roles inside that business. It's about that sort of equitable share of profit every fiscal year. It's supposed to be, I think, a radically humanizing experience. I think that's the point of a worker co-op. And I still sit on the board of the Canadian Worker Co-op Federation. I'm extremely passionate about worker co-ops, while still recognizing that, and I think I don't want to get into this too much, but I do think it needs to be said, I question the ability for enterprise to create meaningful change in our society. I really do. And I know we are all engaged in enterprise in some degree, and we need to be, but I saw the structuration that happened at the Allium, primarily through relationships with landlords and banks. And those things fundamentally limit our capacity to create meaningful change, I believe. But without getting too much into that. So consumer co-ops, worker co-ops, and then hybrid co-ops, which are obviously just a blend of the two. And so in a worker co-op like the Allium, where we were radically ethically guided, I think we were ethically guided to a fault, if I could say that, because we still, again, had to operate a business in the world, and we chose such a lofty ideals that we were just shooting ourselves in the foot every step of the way. It was just no, we're not going to order from GFS or Cisco, and we do need to pay people as much as we can, and we're not ever going to use DoorDash or Uber Eats. We're ultimately competing in this ecosystem where people that play by those rules just have an inherent leg up, and it's because our pool of available capital is limited, and then our stress begins to increase, and then it's all these things that sort of interlock. And so
I think at its core, the thing that fascinates me about co-ops is there's no other business structure where in its DNA is really rooted in relationships.
Yes.
And so because when you kind of make these comments about enterprise isn't going to be the thing that saves us, and yet you're creating an enterprise, can you kind of talk about that nuance there, Jared?
Yeah, it took me a long time to be okay with my own ambiguity, but I am totally okay with it. I think we are inherent contradictions, and I think it's important we recognize and accept that, both sides of ourselves. And so I recognize, for me, capitalism, and it's such a buzz thing. I don't think that we have a well-defined collective understanding of capitalism to really even begin talking about this. But for me, capitalism is the issue, right? Quote unquote. And so, sorry, I lost it again, Phil.
That's okay.
A tough day. It's a couple kids
coming after a long weekend. But this actually is a good reminder. When we define success in capitalism, it's often using metrics that are about growth, expansion, more locations, profits. And what I was hoping to anchor this conversation as well is, how do we celebrate all the amazing things that happened at the Allium? And how do we view it as a win? Because oftentimes, even as a network, I remember some of our big successes when our members got listed in Costco and went across Canada. Amazing win. What's not to celebrate there? But I think there's also opportunity to celebrate. I remember when we went out for dinner at Allium, we were kind of having this discussion about, and you were laughing, making this joke about lying in bed, creating this socialist vegetarian restaurant. And I was actually thinking the same thing. We're in Cowtown, and it's a plant-based restaurant that is rammed full, And there's all these people who never even heard of what a co-op is, and they're not reading about it, they're experiencing it.
Mhm.
They're able to sit in a restaurant, eat the food, and take it in. So whether or not this restaurant continues on for 40, 50 years from now, the fact that people were able to come in, walk through those doors, and experience a co-op probably sparked some form of inspiration, and we don't know where that's going to form
Thank
years
you.
from now.
Yes, and so reconciling that ambiguity, kind of between recognizing that like inherent contradiction of our economy and me trying to like build something within it, you know. And so for me, that was it. It was like I you know, growing up as like just this like punk anarchist, I was like throw shit at society and burn it down. Like, but it's like no, you can't do that. Like we're all part of this world. We all live in this society. I'm not standing outside in some like ivory tower chucking shit down. Like that's just complete bullshit. It's not an accurate representation of where we're at. So, I mean, it's recognizing that we are part of the system, right? And we start to work within it. But it's like these like, we are structured by an economy that forces us to have little decision, right? And so we kind of resign. Like that's a bit of a resignation. It's like, well, I can't stand outside and throw firebombs at it because obviously that doesn't make sense. And I mean, we're not promoting that here. Are we promoting that? We're not promoting that.
Not this morning.
Okay, not this morning.
No.
So it's like I might as well work from the inside. But we all know, like, you know, absolute power corrupts absolute, or whatever. Like, you know, you start to become part of it, and it's impossible not to.
Right.
It's impossible not to when you're like, the landlord just gave us this $3,000 bill, and I don't understand it. We tried to fight it, but they said it was legit, and now we owe it, and now we have to come up with another $3,000. So we got to start thinking. It's just like, right? It's like all these little death by 1,000 paper cuts is what I always said, especially at a restaurant. You know, it's death by 1,000 paper cuts. Anyways, like you know, I recognize I think to create, it's so much fun to destroy, but like to create is really fun, you know, and I think it's really rewarding. And so recognizing that to create is really our only option, and it's us coming together and thinking critically about this shit. And so the Allium was the option, and a worker co-op made sense because that to me does try to bake in those equitable commitments. And you write bylaws that like guide everyone, you know, and I would love to get into some of the issues at Allium soon, because I mean, I think that was something that I didn't do well enough, because I didn't uphold myself and others to the bylaws that we wrote. And if you don't, you know, if you don't hold people's feet to the flames of your structure, then your structure doesn't matter. But
so before we jump into that, because I definitely want to bring the conversation there, can we just take a moment to actually reflect on some of the biggest successes and moments that you're most proud of with the Allium? Like again, the doors are closed, but I look back on what you were able to like create and inspire and spark in the city as such a massive win. And I know that like there's countless other wins. And so can you just kind of share with the group some of your proudest moments about running the Allium?
I mean, yeah, definitely just like opening it, as I shared, was just like this high that will, you know, I'm like largely dead inside after 5 years and 2 kids, but like there's still this piece that will never die. That's like that, you know, that mountain moment. But like, you know, obviously winning best new restaurant, like standing shoulder to shoulder with some of these like really high-end corporate restaurants. And we were just like total imposter syndrome. Like, what's a bunch of like kids doing here? Like, do they know who we are? Do we belong here? But it was also like this like, yeah, affirmation of like, yeah, we can come together as working class people with minimal capital and builds a product that was like equal to that of these like, you know, multi-million-dollar groups, you know, which was really cool to see. And I think, you know, beyond that, like not losing money in the first year, but like there was like there's a lot of tough interpersonal moments, but I think some of my proudest moments at Allium was like seeing somebody like address some really deep trauma and like people getting clean and like just this like really cool, like it, like for me it's all about humanization. Like that's why we're doing this. Yes, we're doing this so that we can live and have money, but it's like that can't be it. There's got to be something more to that. And for me, that was like this moment of like creating an empowering space where people could come together and learn about ourselves, like and like be, you know, my wife used to always say like in capitalism your job is a romance. Like it's a fling. You meet someone and it's super sexy and you're like, yeah, I'm having a great time and this job is fun. And then eventually it's like the fire fizzles away and people are just kind of like, oh, fuck you. And like somebody gets weird about it and then you break up, you know? But like in a co-op, it's a marriage. And she's right. Like we like, no, like this is weird and awkward, but we're going to like double down. We're going to like go get counseling or whatever. Like we're going to work through it and grow together as a couple. And like those kinds of moments for people that again had the capacity to do that work, I mean, it was amazing. It was like so inspiring, both for myself and other, and that's to me is something that I'll always cherish. And I think too, like a lot of my graduate work that, it ultimately centered around this idea of like, it's like a lofty term, cynosure of diversity, to just say like, you're just trying to like create a beacon, right? That's all we're like, I think for many of us, that's what we're trying to do, is be like in the sea of inequity and be like, hey, like over here, like come park your boat over here, or like come look at this thing over here. There's a different way to do it. And I think that ultimately is the power of these projects, is to be a cynosure of diversity, to show people like there are alternatives, and they are rooted in equity, and there are people that care in this world, and despite us being like kind of smothered by this behemoth of an economic structure, like we can still make little pockets of air. So
awesome.
Can you write that on the board?
So no, which yeah.
At some point.
Yeah. It's been a while since I've been in school. I don't know if I remember how to spell. I think it's like
Sort of on the spelling spot.
no, sure. I was like, I was big into grad school for a while. I just love like 15 syllable words at least.
Let's actually just take a moment to like let that sink in. Like Jared and the team have accomplished a lot, and we're so quick to like figure out what went wrong. But I think they had accomplished so much, and let's just take a moment to kind of just sit in all the amazing successes that Jared and the rest of the team at the Allium have been able to materialize over the past couple of years. I know how much any entrepreneur invests of themselves into their business. And I would imagine with a cooperative, every employee, every member, every person involved is giving of themselves in a way that every entrepreneur can identify with. And so I can imagine it was not an easy decision to close the doors. And it probably was, maybe still is, a period of difficulty and transition for a lot of you in the team. You've spoken to some of these elements like during our talk so far this morning, potentially around, competing against big business and just how regular capitalism operates, holding the feet to the fire of some of the members. Can you maybe elaborate kind of more? Because again, I think there's this huge fascination. We were talking when some people came in, and just like it won best restaurant. When people walked in, it was busy. Like everything seemed like it was humming. And so I think there's like great curiosity as to like why this amazing beacon of hope isn't around anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I've been reflecting a lot on the Allium's life, obviously as of late. And I think there's kind of like two major ways of looking at what happened, and they're not separate, they're very much connected. But I do think there's like this like kind of socio-cultural reason and the structural reason that Allium didn't continue. I think the like socio-cultural one is that we are socialized, we're enculturated in this society. I don't think a lot of people understand this idea of like foregoing immediate personal profit for long-term collective gain. I think that's like a hard thing for us to think, myself included. Like I made the thing, and it was like it's like I'm used to, especially in the restaurant business, like you're used to like walking away with $400 cash every night or whatever. It's like your money, and you want the profit now. And there's this idea that we have such a cult of the individual. There's always this idea of like being the business owner and getting all the profit, and just like, so to think about like restructuring that was hard for a lot of people, especially in the restaurant industry. Like we had a completely flat pay scale. We had full equitable division of tips. So servers that were used to walking with $400 cash were now splitting it equally with the dishwasher and the chef and that was hard for a lot of people. And again, because we are structured by our society, it's like I need to pay my rent and drink 1,000 beers and do drugs all night. Maybe, I don't know but that's unfair. That is a lot of the restaurant industry, unfortunately. So it's like, they don't want to give up their tips. Yeah, exactly, right? And it's like I don't blame people for that. You know, that's hard. That's hard. But beyond that, like definitely, I think like the idea of non-hierarchy also is like a very like attractive proposition for a lot of people. But what it comes to in reality is it's not like it's not just like anarchy. It's like, well, this is non-hierarchical, so I just do whatever I want. It's like you have meaningful, radical responsibility to those around you. That's what that means, you know. And it's like for a lot of people, that's not what that meant, I don't think. And I think that we as a co-op failed to provide adequate training for myself and for everyone. But again, it's like we are structured by the society. We were just trying to make money, right? We had to pay rent. So it's like, when did we have time? Running a restaurant takes all your time, and then it's like, come in on your time off so that you can take like a consensus workshop or something. Like people are like, nah, I don't really want to. Like I was just here 6 days a week. I don't really want to come back on my day off. So I think there is that deep sociocultural barrier, and I don't think that it can't be overcome. I just think like it takes a lot of work, and we need the options to learn about that. And unfortunately, our society does not train like from day one. You are learn to respect authority, and you're in like a hierarchical school system, and you're taught to like get your A's and whatever it is. Like there's just so much of this like counter socialization to the realm of co-ops in some way. And then in terms of like structural, like obviously what I shared was just like, we're operating within a difficult economics reality, and we're trying to create these like equitable purchasing decisions in every step, but then we're just spending tons of money to support these things, and we have less and less money for ourselves, and it becomes more and more difficult. So there were these two, like, I think definitely big barriers that we were up against. As I shared, like, I should have been way harder from, like, we as a team, especially like the base, should have been way harder at the start. A restaurant is I think it's a tough industry to make a worker co-op in. There's so many pieces to it. There's so many moving pieces to it.
So what do you mean by you needed to be harder?
Sorry, harder on members for not buying in. Is what we should have done. Like, so I set this 6-month probation period for people that joined on, after which they had the option to buy in for $5,000.
Gotcha.
And I was constantly terrified at the prospect of not having enough workers in the space, because what that meant was it generally came back on me. And I'm co-managing. I just quit too. Actually, I burned everything to the ground that I could, but I co-managed a nonprofit too through this whole period. So it's like, that was also my failure. I think I spread myself too thin. But like, so I knew that if there wasn't enough people in the space to run the business, and they were always going to call me, and then I was going to have to come into work. And I was just like, I was burning the candle at all ends, and it was like, I just didn't want that. So that fear actually really structured me too. I was like, I just need to have people here, and I don't want to lose people. So if someone doesn't want to buy in after 6 months, I'm not going to say anything really, because I don't want to have to hire someone and then train them again and blah, blah, blah. But I told everyone from day one, like, if you don't buy in, you are never getting a raise, because that was the way we structured it. I always said, I don't want to give people crumbs from the pie. I want people to come join us at the table and eat the pie. And so if you didn't buy in, you don't get a raise. And so I told all of these employees that didn't end up buying in, like, if you don't buy in, you're never gonna get a raise, and all this time is gonna pass. You're gonna get really resentful, and it's gonna get bad. And people always be like, no, it's fine, it's fine, it's fine. I'm like, no, this is what's gonna happen. Like, I really think you should either consider buying in or leaving, but I'm not gonna push you out, And I should have pushed people out.
So was it at your peak you had 8 members then? And
Yeah.
like, how was like, and it sounds like you had interviewed or connected with 50 different possible members. What was that process like in like the economic model that we're in today? Like, was it hard finding individuals who wanted to be members?
Yeah, definitely. Like we would table at farmers markets, just with like nothing, like no product. We just had I had printed pamphlets on worker co-ops, and people were like, what are you selling? We're like, the good word of worker co-op. They were just like, oh fuck, like, don't talk to me. Like, put posters up at all the universities, because we thought that was maybe a good recruitment ground. I used to talk about like hanging out behind alleys, like with people, like with the disgruntled kitchen workers, and with like worker co-op pamphlets in my pocket, like, hey, you interested? You want to liberate yourself? No. So yeah, it was really tough. It was really tough. And like, that was it. When we were operating, like that was the start where we had time to meet people and talk. But when we were operating, it was just, we needed employees, right? So if somebody left, it was like, what do? We made an ad on Kijiji or whatever on Instagram. We're like, hey, the Allium's looking to hire. And it's like, we want collective minded folks. And like, but like half the time, like I'd say almost 95% of those hires were just people who liked the idea of the Allium, they liked the idea of a non-hierarchical space, and they wanted to work in a cool restaurant or whatever, but they never had any intention of buying in. And we made everyone sign a document that said, I am planning to buy in after 6 months, and like I recognize I don't get a raise unless I buy in. Like we wanted to make it super clear to everyone, but it was like, it wasn't fair. Like I shouldn't have hired those people, probably.
It sounds so surprising, Jared, because like in the world today, it seems like entrepreneurialism is sexier than ever. Whenever I talk to university grads, everyone's wanting to be a solopreneur, like start up their own business. So it seems like a disconnect. This seems like I could be an entrepreneur and be a part of a community. Like I thought, it seems like it'd be an easy sell.
I think it's the work of restaurants. I think it's the work of restaurants, to be honest.
Really?
I do think a lot of it is the industry, unfortunately. Like I said, it's just like, it's just not a great industry for worker co-ops, I don't believe. And I think, I'm not saying it's impossible because they do exist, but I think it is reflected in the worker co-op ecosystem. I mean, how many restaurants are there? I think there was one and it just shut down, I heard. Yeah.
Sidewalk Citizens still?
The Grain Exchange, maybe. They closed. They shut down. Like there are others. Like I was working. Throughout the Allium, my goal has always been to seed worker co-ops. That was always my goal.
Yeah.
I'm just going to use this as a synonym of diversity to explain to people what this is, and then just try and seed them. So like.
And you gave away your business plan.
Oh, I've worked with probably 15 to 20 different groups throughout the Allium's life to just try to help them make a worker co-op.
And you just gave away all of your intellectual property.
Anything and everything I could. Bylaws, lawyer review documents, everything. And that offer still stands to everyone here if anyone's interested. Like I'll connect you with the Canadian Worker Co-op Federation, and there's like some low grants you can, or funding that you can access. There's all kinds of things. There's a network there anyways. And that's something that to me is always important. Like this is the motto for me of worker co-ops is stronger together. Like I just used to like yell that, stronger together. People are like, shut up, Jared.
And one of the pillars of co-ops is co-ops supporting other co-ops.
Yes.
And so, Jared, I think there's some people in the audience that are curious about, like, you mentioned taking a workshop on consensus decision making. I'm sure other people are really curious. Like, you've got like 8 owners. How the hell do you make a decision on anything?
So, I mean, we used a governance structure called holacracy, and it's just essentially think of just like hubs. You have hubs. So like in the restaurant, we have like a kitchen hub and a front of house hub and an admin hub and a procurement hub and a waste stream management hub. And what else do we have? A hiring hub or something. Anyways, there's all these hubs, right? And people, ideally in a proper non-hierarchical consensus-based space, those leaders of these hub positions would rotate, and those leaders, quote unquote, are not like they have any power again. They're just radically responsible to the people in their hub, and then that hub reports back to the wider co-op. So any like real consensus in a business structure is like wildly ridiculous. Like you would not be like every decision like, hey everyone, I need to buy this, or like that would just take forever. That does not, I don't think you want to create more bureaucracy in your life. I don't think anyone does. So it's like empowering hubs to make those decisions, allows for that like sort of flexibility of business work while rotating those roles allows for that training, right? That co-humanization piece.
It sounds like a completely different way of being though. Like whether as a worker or an owner, it just seems like a different way of communication, a different way of being in relation. How did that model work?
Super imperfectly.
Yeah,
super imperfectly.
Okay.
The hub leads didn't rotate a lot. A lot of people didn't want them. I'd say at the end, like I mentioned, like I was the lead of the kitchen hub and the bar hub and the front of house hub and the hiring hub. And, so like it didn't work. Unfortunately, it didn't, to be perfectly honest.
So question for you, Jared. Would this have worked if it wasn't a co-op?
I mean, restaurants work, I guess. Yes. Yeah, like in a very different way. I mean, it's be way too hard for me to say, because that's ultimately the reason, like that was the big motivating factor for me to shut down, was like, we weren't really a co-op, you know, and I wasn't there to make a restaurant. I never wanted to just make a restaurant. It was nice to see like, hey, we made a semi like successful. I mean, we weren't losing money and we were making a bit of money and this was looking like a good profit year. Like we made a restaurant and it worked well, but like, it's not what we were trying to do. You know, it was never the goal. And I think this is something important to stress, is like that failure is awesome. Like don't I think we have a fear of failure. I mean, God, I know I did and I do, but it's like, it's good. It's so good for us, you know, to like try something, whatever, anything. And then just be like, fuck, that was awful. It's not what I wanted at all. And then burn it down, you know, take your lessons, pick out your lessons from the ashes and like go try again. It's the only way. It's the only way.
It's funny you mentioned failure, because when we had initially promoted this workshop, we used this tagline like, our co-op's dead. And then the image that we had to promote it was like a gravestone that had like, rest in peace co-ops. Part of the reason why we did this is we wanted to be controversial, and we knew that like the Allium, like everyone loved the Allium, and so there was a bit of like sensationalizing and drama to it. But ultimately, like at Be Local, we freaking love the co-op structure, and there's so many people who don't know about it, and so we thought, let's create some controversy, and let's bring some people into the conversation. Understandably, it wasn't well received, that tagline, so we pivoted a bit. But the spirit behind it was to like really draw more attention to this business structure that I think can be a powerful vehicle for change. And so anyways, for those of you who were watching and they weren't a big fan of the tagline, I apologize, but it was well-intentioned. And so this is just to piggyback off of Jared's, like, let's fail miserably big and fail quickly. So we pivoted on that. I just want to comment on one other thing, Jared. Like when Christina and I went for dinner, like I think it was your second last week.
Yeah.
You had mentioned that, like, and you just mentioned it today, like you were never in the business to run a restaurant, and you were in a restaurant serving out food. And that just like struck me really like to my core. Like this was someone who created this entity to create disruption and change in the world, and it just so happened to be a restaurant. Can you talk about that a little bit, please?
Yeah, I think that was something we all kind of decided early days too, was like, we didn't want to be like this outward, like hippie restaurant that you walk in right away and you're like, this is a worker co-op, and we see it and you know, like, oh, these people are like, you know the place, right? And I love that place. I'm not gonna fully shit talk about, like, there are a few things about it I don't love, but I do love that place. But that was never our goal, you know. And again, as I mentioned, this business grew out of a desire to engage and to push into the structures of society a bit. That's really what I wanted to do. Mm-hmm. And so to me, ultimately, like the form didn't matter so much, because like the heart, the like armature, the very base of it was what it was, you know. And I just needed to wrap it in something. It didn't matter what it was wrapped in. And again, like I shared, like unfortunately, what I knew was restaurants. I sometimes wonder, like, what if we did do something else? Right. You know, or like we talked about, my partner and I, when we were first talking about this project, we were like, let's go do it in like Nelson or Vancouver or Victoria somewhere. We're like, let's be with our people, quote unquote. And we were like, do we want to do this in an echo chamber, or do we want to do it in a place that like it needs to be done? We felt like. And we made a choice, and I'm like, I want to be in an echo chamber right now. No, that's a little bit though, a little bit. But yeah, so I mean, it was just a way to engage. I just like really annoyingly and at a like macro level resistance theory stage for a sec. I just want to share, like, there are, as I understand it, there's 3 major ways to like create impactful change in our world, and these are I'm talking about like big change, right? So we have like ruptural transformations, which is like this classic, like, you know, cut the head off the king and get the pitchforks and like burn the castle down. And like that it generally doesn't work super well, because you have this thing called the transition trough, where people like kill everything and everyone, and then everyone that's left is like, this is really fucked up and I don't like this. Like, can someone get me a king back, please? I just want to like sit at a table. And generally that's what happens. There's symbiotic transformations. So I would say that's like voting, right? Like we exist within the existing structure and we try to like push into it. So we vote NDP, right? We all vote NDP. And then there's interstitial transformations. And so if you think about like a fence, there's like the interstices, the gaps in a fence. That's what an interstice is. And so interstitial transformation is this idea of like finding those gaps in society. And you just try to push into them a tiny bit and just open them up a little bit. And that to me was hopefully what the Allium, it was sort of like a play of, I guess, like symbiotic and interstitial engagement, because the goal was to like find these little gaps in society. And it's not about like, again, it's not just about complaining and yelling. Like you're trying to be like, hey, here's some fucked up shit. And I'm like pushing into it and I'm creating solutions right now. And like, look, everyone, we're making solutions. And so meaningful transformation theory says that these three things need to occur all together. And so like, unfortunately, you know, I don't know how much I believe that like the revolution is coming, but like sometimes I like to pretend it is. And like, you know, I ultimately the goal is like, if you don't engage with society in any meaningful way, that ruptural transformation will always be for naught, right? And it's like, ideally it's not violent and whatever, but like, yes, we do need to create symbiotic and interstitial engagements. And like, that's, I guess, my really heady, annoying way of like encouraging you all to like find those gaps. I think that to me is the most powerful thing, is we find those gaps and we push into them however we can.
That's a perfect segue for my next question then, Jared. Like, so again, our co-op's dead wasn't a serious question. Like, if anything, I want co-ops to flourish. So what do you see as the future for co-ops, and how are co-ops potentially more relevant today than they were historically?
Yeah, I mean, I can say that like in the Canadian Worker Co-op Federation and our national organization, we are seeing a rise in both worker co-ops and worker co-op interest, and it's notable. And I think it just quite plainly reflects the reality of our economic structure, of our society that we currently live in. Things are getting harder and more expensive, and it's like not like we've seen that real wages have stagnated essentially since the 70s, but our cost of living has increased. Like these are just true things that are happening. We're all encountering, whether we want to admit them or like them or not, you know. And so people, again, banding together, like it's not, unfortunately, it's not, sorry, I hate just like living in the land of heady theory, but it's where I live. So like, you know, historically it was the nation state that was supposed to be the arbiter of capital and labor, of the market and labor. Like the state came in and was like, this was fucked up. Like we actually, you can't pay people $2 an hour, and you can't make kids work, and you can't whatever, right? And it still plays that role to a degree, but largely it's been co-opted, I would say, by the interest of capital. And so it's not the state that's going to come in now and play that mediating force. It will do it, but to an extent. And so, I mean, who does that land on? That's civil society. That's us, right? That's the only way that we begin to push back in. And so we as humans, I guess, just need to come together and make those projects. Sorry, I lost my train of thought though. I completely apologize.
So maybe we're gonna wrap things up shortly here, Jared. And so I think everyone's like, if anything, is anyone not curious about exploring more about co-ops? I think if anything, like you piqued everyone's interest. In terms of like maybe closing out on some final like words of advice or any major insights you had, like again, this was an incredible learning opportunity for you and the team. What are some of your biggest takeaways as you move into the next chapter of your journey?
I think, like, as I've stressed probably a couple times, is like, be okay with your ambiguity. I think it's so important. Like, it's good to set that, like, that North Star, you know, and have that goal, and then just like fucking fail so miserably on your way there, and just be okay with it, you know. I think forgiving, like being okay with it internally too, is super important. Like I held myself to this ideal that was unattainable, and then when I didn't hit it, it just kept torturing me, and it's like, that's just useless. Like be okay with what you are and what you have, and like just forgive yourself, right? When you fuck up, you know. And that's like the big thing too, is like sometimes we ignore like the human element. Like this is all about like making these enterprises are all resting on humans, right? Like that's how they happen. So like, you know, I think it's so important that we help train each other how to like live in a collective reality, because I don't know that we fully understand it. We are all like filled with our childhood trauma and the stories of our youth and whatever, and it's like we need to be able to help one another like get into conflict and be weird and then move through it and get out of it. And I think that's so important. Like if we don't do that, we will not create worker co-ops, and we will not have co-ops supporting worker co-ops. And you know, so I think it's really important that we do that internal work while forgiving ourselves and being okay with, you know, what we didn't do well. I think that to me is like honestly the most important thing. Yeah, just keep failing. Just keep getting out there and fail. Sorry, that's not inspiring at all. But like really, yeah, it's important. It's important. But you know, and it's easier said than done, because obviously that failure is often tied to like our true economic figure, and that's where it gets scary. So it's like, again, if we pool together our capital as workers, that fear becomes less. The fall is not as far. You know, the fail is not as far.
Awesome. Maybe one more question, and then we're going to transition to the next part of today. So today's conversation is really meant about inspiration. The next part is about integration. The next phase really is about how do you apply some of these new learnings to your own business? And how do you, like, again, dive deeper and take this conversation to these levels that maybe you didn't have the opportunity to through the questions that Jen was fielding. There's a lot of entrepreneurs in the room, Jared. Like you gave some advice about like failing massively and failing boldly. In terms of, this is your opportunity to disrupt on an individual business level. Why should a business consider maybe exploring taking on a co-op as their business structure?
Yeah, I think it's scary, especially for a lot of solopreneurs. You know, if it would be so hard if you put in so much of your time and life, you know, starting a business and then looking at a worker owner succession, because like you got to give up. You give up a bit, you know, and that is the hardest thing. I think letting go is one of the most challenging experiences from worker co-ops. Any collective enterprise or goal. But I think that the payout is maybe far more valuable, and I don't mean like financial payout, because you're obviously foregoing some of that too if you move to a worker co-op model. But it is that just like, honestly, it's just that humanization piece. It's that feeling of not being alone in this. It's that feeling of like, if you do start to like face financial difficulties or troubling times, you're not just like, God, it's such an isolating feeling to be alone through that. Even if you have friends or people that support you, like it's not the same as like, hey, you're like in lockstep with me struggling right now. We're gonna work through this together. Like that is a powerful thing to have with you. I think beyond that though is the rewards of like just being in a co-humanizing space, of like trying to like restructure your thought from the books and the money, which is always prevalent. And it has to be, but it's like you get to really start to like radically incorporate social and equitable commitments because you're forced to. You know, it's sort of like that necessary, I don't know, that necessary fork in the road. You won't come to it if you're just a solopreneur. And then when you begin to like extend to other, it makes you make this sort of pivot at some point. And there's all those benefits of being with other, I think. You know, I believe that. Some people are just like, you know, curmudgeon-y old lone wolves, and maybe they don't want to do this, but
amazing.
If people are interested in any worker co-op like info or resources, like the Canadian Worker Co-op Federation, CWCF, is an amazing resource. Provincially, regionally, we have the ACCA, the Alberta Community Co-op Association. They're a little more status quo, I would say, but they still provide a lot of useful resources. So, I mean, those are two great places to turn. And then like, please just connect with me anytime, because I do believe powerfully in worker co-ops. I mean, ours failed, but it was great. It was a wonderful failure. And I'm so proud of what we did here in the city, you know, and I think that we just need to keep building them up. I think if it wasn't a restaurant, it may have had a lot better chance. So I don't know if anyone, but it seems like probably no one else has a restaurant here. I hope not, for your sake. Oh yeah, you're okay though. I'm already helping you. You'll be all right.
So it's a beautiful close, Jared, because I think that's also the reason for the Be Local network, is this idea that there's a lot of entrepreneurs out there who are trying to do business differently, trying to do business where it's just not just about financial profit. And oftentimes it can feel really isolating and lonely because you think you're the only person out there doing it on your own, caring about things more than just a financial buck. And so the Be Local network is meant to like be a tribe for you to find your peers and to inspire one another. And that's why folks like Jared are part of the network, so that we can learn and grow together in community. And so I loved everything you had to say about co-humanizing, Jared. I think we should all co-humanize over breakfast now, and so that I don't have to eat alone. But I think there was just so many like seeds of inspiration, and I'd love for us all to unpack this and process it together in community. So let's give one final huge round of applause to Jared. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Oh, and one other thing to put on your radar before I forget, two big things, actually. One is in August, we're going to be hosting one of our quarterly networking events. If you were at our last networking event, it was this massive bonfire at the top of St. Patrick Island. And we had a cellist, and we had a guitarist and a singer there. This isn't a regular business network. And so we're not just going to go and swap business cards. We're going to bring in art. We're going to bring in music. We're going to bring in nature. We're going to bring in stillness. And we're going to bring in inspiration. So for our next networking event, there's going to be a teaser. There's going to be some ice cream. There's going to be some fire. There's going to be some water. Maybe there's going to be some canoeing and paddle boating. But that we only do 4 of these a year. And the idea is that we have must-attend events where you're bombarded with invitations to stuff, and we know what it's like to be an entrepreneur. So what we do is we try to create magical networking events that cut through the noise so that you're like, hell yeah, I need to be there for that. So that's coming up in August. Keep an eye on our communications for that. The other thing that I also want to put on your radar is Social Venture Institute from August 23rd to 25th. It's going to be taking place up north of Edmonton at a place called Métis Crossing. This is basically a 3-day summer camp for social entrepreneurs. We're going to have bonfires by the river. We're going to have a bison barbecue. We're going to have concerts at night. During the day, we're going to have crazy inspiration from social entrepreneurs. We've got an incredible heavyweight keynote speaker this year. The Chief Impact Officer of Benevity is going to be our keynote. So that is, for those of you who don't know, Benevity is a local startup, a tech startup. A unicorn valued at over $1 billion. And so their Chief Impact Officer, Sona, is going to be our keynote. And so we get some incredible speakers, incredible inspiration, 3 days in nature with a community unlike any other. Bring a Kleenex box because there's going to be lots of inspiration. So definitely come out to that August 23rd to 25th.